Last night, I dreamt I went to Manderley again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive, and for a while I couldn't enter, for it was chained and padlocked. Then, like all dreamers, I was suddenly possessed with supernatural powers and passed like a spirit through the barrier. The drive wound away in front of me, twisting and turning as it had always done, but as I advanced, I was aware that a change had come upon it. It was narrow and unkept, choked with grass and moss. On and on it wound. I hadn't thought the way to the house so long, and then suddenly I came upon it. Manderley. Our Manderley. Secretive and silent as it had always been. The grey stone shining in the moonlight, the mullioned windows reflecting the terrace that sloped to the lawns, and the lawns that stretched to the sea. Moonlight can play odd tricks upon the fancy. As I stood there, I could swear that the house wasn't an empty shell, but lived and breathed. Light came from the windows and curtains blew softly in the night air. Then a cloud hovered for an instant upon the moon, and the illusion went with it. The lights in the windows were extinguished. I looked upon a desolate shell, a sepulchre, our fear and suffering buried in the ruins. For Manderley was ours no longer. Manderley was no more. We can never go back again, that much is certain. But we've come through our crisis, and, catching his smile, I know we are together, no barrier between us. I've lost my diffidence, my timidity. I'm very different from that self with straight hair and youthful, unpowdered face, trailing in the wake of Mrs. Van Hopper like a shy, uneasy colt. She'd precede me into the ornate dining room of the Hotel Côte d'Azur at Monte Carlo, her short body ill-balanced upon tottering high heels, her new hat pierced with a monster quill aslant upon her head. She'd make for her usual table in the corner and, lifting her lorgnette to her small pig's eyes, survey the scene. Not a single well-known personality. What do the management think I come here for? To look at the page boys? But then I saw that the table next to ours, vacant for 3 days, was to be occupied once more. The maître d'hôtel, with a particular bow reserved for his more special patrons, was ushering in the new arrival. Mrs. Van Hopper reached for her lorgnette, then folded it with a snap. She leant across the table, her small eyes bright with excitement. "It's Max de Winter, the man who owns Manderley. Oh, he looks ill, doesn't he? They say he can't get over his wife's death." I wonder what my life would be today if Mrs. Van Hopper hadn't been a snob. For many years she'd come to the Hotel Côte d'Azur, and, apart from bridge, her one pastime, notorious by now in Monte Carlo, was to manoeuvre an introduction to visitors of distinction. I can see her on that unforgettable afternoon as though it were yesterday. She was on her favourite sofa, midway between the restaurant and the reception hall, having rushed through dessert so that she could install herself where the new arrival must pass. Suddenly she turned to me. "Go upstairs quickly and find that last letter from my nephew." When I returned, I saw that the newcomer had left the restaurant, and she, fearful of losing him, had risked a barefaced introduction on her own. He was sitting beside her on the sofa. I walked across and gave her the letter. He rose at once, while Mrs. Van Hopper waved a vague hand in my direction and mumbled my name. "Mr. De Winter is having coffee with us. Go and ask the waiter for another cup." Her abrupt method of introduction was meant to show that I could safely be ignored. It was a surprise, therefore, to find that he remained standing, and it was he who signalled the waiter. "I'm afraid I must contradict you," he said. "You are both having coffee with me." And before I knew what had happened, he was sitting in my hard chair, and I was on the sofa beside Mrs. Van Hopper. For a moment she looked annoyed, but she soon composed her face and chatted on, asking him about Manderley. "I've seen pictures of it, of course, and it looks perfectly enchanting. I wonder you can ever bear to leave it." His silence was painful, but she ran on. I felt the colour flood my face. I think he realised my distress, for he leant forward and spoke to me. "What do you think of Monte Carlo?" I started saying something obvious, but before I could finish, Mrs. Van Hopper was back in full flood. In the end, it was a page boy who released him, with the news that a dressmaker awaited Mrs. Van Hopper in her suite. The next morning, Mrs. Van Hopper woke with a sore throat and a temperature of 102. I rang her doctor, who came round at once and diagnosed influenza. "You are to stay in bed until I allow you to get up," he told her. He turned to me. "I should prefer that Mrs. Van Hopper had a trained nurse. You can't possibly lift her. It'll only be for a fortnight or so." To my surprise, she agreed. I think she enjoyed the fuss it would create, the visits and messages from friends, the arrival of flowers. After the nurse had arrived, I went down for lunch a good half-hour before our usual time. I expected the restaurant to be empty, and so it was, except for the table next to ours. No doubt he was lunching early because he hoped to avoid us at 1 o'clock. He summoned the waiter. "Lay another place at my table. Mademoiselle will have luncheon with me." We sat down, and he gave me the menu and went on with his hors d'oeuvre as though nothing had happened. "What's happened to your friend?" he said. I told him about the influenza. "I'm so sorry." There was a pause. "Is she a relation? Have you known her long?" "She's my employer. She's training me to be a thing called a companion." "Why do you do it?" he said. "I need to earn a living." "Haven't you any family?" "They're dead." "Tell me about them." There was a strange air of unreality about that luncheon. There was I, so much of a schoolgirl still, sharing my family history with a man I didn't know. My shyness fell away from me, and out they all came, the little secrets of childhood, the pleasures and the pains. Suddenly I glanced at the clock. We'd been sitting there an hour and a half, and the conversation had been mine alone. I tumbled down into reality, self-conscious, my face aflame, and began to stammer my apologies. He wouldn't listen to me. "I've enjoyed this hour with you more than anything for a very long time. Now, what are you going to do with your holiday?" I thought of the cobbled square in Monaco. I could be off there by 3 o'clock with my sketchbook and pencil, and I told him as much. "I'll drive you there in the car," he said. When we arrived, the wind was too high for sketching, so back to the car we went and drove I know not where. Suddenly he began to talk about Manderley, how from the terrace you could hear the ripple of the coming tide washing in the bay, how the pathway led you down to the hard white shingle of the beach. Dusk fell without my noticing it, and soon we'd returned to the hotel. I felt for my gloves, and my fingers closed also upon a book whose slim covers told of poetry. I peered at the title as the car stopped. "You can read it if you like," he said. I was glad. I wanted some possession of his now that the day was finished. I couldn't face Mrs. Van Hopper, so I sat in the corner of the lounge and took up the book of poems. It opened at the title page, and I read the dedication. Max, from Rebecca, 1st of May, written in a curious slanting hand, the name Rebecca standing out black and strong, the tall sloping R dwarfing the other letters. I shut the book with a snap, remembering Mrs. Van Hopper in the restaurant the day before, her small pig's eyes darting to the neighbouring table. "An appalling tragedy. The papers were full of it, of course. They say he never talks about it, never mentions her name. She was drowned, you know, in the bay near Manderley." "What have you been doing this morning?" I can hear Mrs. Van Hopper now, propped against her pillows, and I would feel the guilty flush form patches on my neck. "I've been playing tennis with a professional." But I hadn't played tennis with a professional once since she'd lain in bed, and that was a little over a fortnight now. I wondered why I didn't tell her that every morning I drove with Maxim de Winter, and then lunched with him. I remember nothing of where we went. All I remember is the feel of the leather seats, and how one day, looking at the clock, I thought to myself, this moment now, at 11:20, this must never be lost. Throwing discretion to the wind, I said, I'd like to know why you ask me to come out in the car day after day. You're being kind, that's obvious, but why do you choose me for your charity? I remember the silence. It became minutes, and the minutes became miles. Everything is over now, I thought. I'll never drive with him again. Suddenly he drew up by the side of the road. Something happened a year ago that altered my whole life. I must begin living all over again. But for you, I should have left Monte Carlo long ago, gone on to Italy, Greece, further still perhaps. You've spared me those wanderings. You've blotted out the past for me. Damn your idea of my kindness and my charity. I ask you to come with me because I want you and your company. Then he started up the engine. As I poured out Mrs. Van Hopper's coffee at breakfast, she flung a letter at me. Helen's sailing for New York on Saturday. That's decided me. We're going too. I'm tired to death of Europe. Go down to reception right away and sort out the details. It was all over. Tomorrow evening I'd be in the train, while the miles carried me away from him. The day was spent in packing, and in the evening people came to say goodbye. We dined in the suite, and she went to bed directly afterwards. Next morning she began grumbling. I hate hanging about once everything's packed. Go down to the office and see if we can leave by the earlier train. I ran along the passage and climbed the stairs, 3 at a time, up to the 3rd floor. I hammered at his door. Come in, he shouted. He was shaving by the open window. What do you want? He said. Is something the matter? I've come to say goodbye. We're leaving for New York this morning. She only decided yesterday, and I was afraid I shouldn't see you again. I felt I must see you before I left, to thank you. He took the soap off his face. Sit down. I'll dress in the bathroom. I shan't be long. He was ready in 5 minutes. Come down to the terrace while I eat my breakfast, he said. I've got to talk to you. I looked at my watch. I haven't time. I ought to be in the office now, changing the reservations. Never mind about that, he said. We went down in the lift and out to the terrace, where the tables were laid for breakfast. So, Mrs. Van Hopper has had enough of Monte Carlo and wants to go home. Well, so do I. She to New York and I to Manderley. Which would you prefer? You can take your choice. Either you go to America with Mrs. Van Hopper, or you come home to Manderley with me. Do you mean you will want a secretary or something? No, you little fool. I'm asking you to marry me. I first met Maxim de Winter in Monte Carlo, when I was employed as a paid companion to the odious Mrs. Van Hopper. She was a social snob, and knew at once that he owned a wonderful house called Manderley, and that his wife had been killed in a boating accident the previous year. What she didn't know was that, while she was laid up with influenza, Maxim de Winter had been driving me around Monte Carlo, that we had fallen in love, and that on the day we were to leave for New York, he proposed. Am I going to break the news to Mrs. Van Hopper? Said Maxim. Or are you? You tell her. She'll be so angry. I followed him up to our suite. Is that you? Called Mrs. Van Hopper from the sitting room. What in the name of Mike have you been doing? He went into the sitting room, saying, I'm afraid it's all my fault, and shut the door behind him. A few minutes later, he emerged. All's well. Shock made her speechless at first, but she's recovering. I'm going downstairs to make certain she'll catch the first train. Go and talk to her." Mrs. Van Hopper was standing by the window, her ridiculous hat perched sideways on her head. She smiled in an odd way that I didn't like. "Well, I've got to hand it to you. Still waters certainly run deep. How did you manage it?" I didn't know what to answer. "He tells me he wants to marry you in a few days. It's lucky you haven't a family to ask questions. I rather wonder what his friends will think, but I suppose that's up to him." She looked at me, something inquisitive, unpleasant about her eyes. "Tell me, have you been doing anything you shouldn't?" "Oh, well, never mind. He's a very attractive creature, I grant you, but personally I think you're making a big mistake. You'll have your work cut out as mistress of Manderley. To be perfectly frank, my dear, I simply can't see you doing it." We came to Manderley in early May, motoring down from London. It was about 5 o'clock when Maxim said, "You see that great belt of trees on the brow of the hill there, with a scrap of sea beyond? That's Manderley in there." I forced a smile, aware now of a stab of panic. Any measure of self-possession I'd gained during the brief 7 weeks of marriage was like a rag now, fluttering before the wind. Turning a corner, we came to the beginning of a high wall. "Here we are," he said, and I gripped the leather seat of the car. The road curved, and before us, on the left, were 2 high iron gates, beside a lodge, open wide to the long drive beyond. We drove through, and the drive twisted and turned like a serpent. Above our heads was a great colonnade of trees, their branches thickly entwined. On we went, over a little bridge, and still the drive ran like an enchanted ribbon through the dark woods. Then the trees thinned, and on either side of us was a wall of blood red, reaching far above our heads. We were amongst the rhododendrons, luscious and fantastic. I saw the drive broaden. We turned the last corner, and so we came to Manderley. Yes, there it was, a thing of grace and beauty, lovelier even than I'd imagined. Its terraces sloping to the gardens, and the gardens to the sea. As we drove up to the wide stone steps, I saw through one of the mullioned windows that the hall was full of people. I heard Maxim swear under his breath. He turned to me. "I'm afraid Mrs. Danvers has collected the whole damned staff in the house and on the estate to welcome us. Oh, it's all right. You won't have to say anything. I'll do it all." Feeling slightly sick, I fumbled with the handle of the car door. As I did so, the butler came down the steps, followed by a footman. He opened the door for me and helped me from the car. "Well, here we are, Frith," said Maxim. "Everyone well?" "Yes, sir, thank you, sir. Glad to see you home, and Madam too." Maxim jerked his head at the hall. "I didn't expect this business." The man's face was expressionless. "Mrs. Danvers' orders, sir." Maxim turned to me. "Come on. It won't take long." We went together up the flight of steps. Someone advanced from the throng. Someone tall and gaunt, dressed in deep black, whose prominent cheekbones and great hollow eyes gave her a skull's face, parchment white. She came towards me, and I held out my hand, envying her dignity and composure. But when she took my hand, hers was limp and heavy, deathly cold. "This is Mrs. Danvers," said Maxim. In a voice as cold and lifeless as her hands had been, she bade me welcome to Manderley, in the name of herself and her staff. When she finished, she waited. And I remember going scarlet, stammering some sort of thanks in return and dropping both my gloves in my confusion. She stooped to pick them up, and as she handed them to me, I saw a little smile of scorn upon her lips. Maxim took my arm and, perfectly free from embarrassment, made a little speech of thanks. Then he bore me off to the library for tea. As we entered, 2 cocker spaniels came from the fireside to greet us. They pawed at Maxim, their long silken ears strained back with affection, and then they came to me, sniffing at my heels, rather uncertain. One was the mother, blind in one eye, and she soon took herself back to the fire. But Jasper, the younger, put his nose into my hand and laid a chin upon my knee, his tail a thump when I stroked his silken ears. Soon tea was brought to us, a stately little performance effected by Frith and the young footman, while Maxim glanced through his great pile of letters. I thought how little I knew of his life here at Manderley. The last weeks had gone so swiftly, and I, driving by his side through France and Italy, had thought only of how I loved him, asking no questions of the past and future, content with the glory of the present. After a while, Frith came in with a footman to clear the tea. "Mrs. Danvers wondered, madam, whether you'd like to see your room." Maxim glanced up from his letters. "What sort of job have they made of the East Wing?" "Very nice indeed, sir. The men cleared out last Monday. I should imagine you'd be very comfortable there, sir. It's a lot lighter, of course, on that side of the house." "Have you been making alterations?" I asked. "Nothing much," said Maxim. "Only redecorating the suite in the East Wing, which I thought we'd use for ours. It was the visitors' wing when my mother was alive. I'll just finish these letters and then I'll come up and join you. Run along and make friends with Mrs. Danvers. It's a good opportunity." I got up and followed Frith out into the vast hall. "It's very big, isn't it?" I said. "Yes, madam. Manderley's a big place. This was the banqueting hall in olden times. It's still used on great occasions, such as a big dinner or a ball, and the public are admitted here once a week." A black figure stood waiting for me at the head of the stairs. I went up towards Mrs. Danvers, and she waited motionless, her hands folded before her, her eyes never leaving my face. I summoned a smile, which wasn't returned. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting," I said. "It's for you to make your own time, madam," she answered. "I'm here to carry out your orders." She turned through the archway of the gallery to the corridor beyond. In the days that followed, I often mistook one part of the great house for another, and on more than one occasion I had to ask a passing servant for directions. Once I found myself wandering into the closed-up west wing, and was surprised to find Mrs. Danvers there. I gathered then that it was in the west wing, facing the sea, that Maxim had lived with Rebecca, and that the largest and most magnificent bedroom in the house had been hers. A few days later, Maxim thought it was time I met his sister, Beatrice, her husband Giles, and the estate manager, Frank Crawley, and he arranged for them to lunch with us. When they arrived, Maxim went down to greet them. I came down a few minutes later and stood for a moment outside the morning room, listening to the hum of voices. Then, turning the handle, I blundered in, to be met, it seemed, with a sea of faces and a general silence. "Here she is at last," said Maxim. "Here's Beatrice, and this is Giles, and this is Frank Crawley." Beatrice was tall, broad-shouldered, very handsome, very much like Maxim about the eyes and jaw, but not as smart as I'd expected, much tweedier. The sort of person who'd nurse dogs through distemper, know about horses, shoot well. She shook hands very firmly, looking me straight in the eyes, and then turned to Maxim. "Quite different from what I expected. Doesn't answer to your description at all." Everyone laughed, and I joined in, not quite certain if the laugh was against me or not, wondering secretly what it was she'd expected and what had been Maxim's description. "And this is Giles," said Maxim. Giles stretched out an enormous paw and wrung my hand, genial eyes smiling from behind horn-rimmed glasses. "Frank Crawley," said Maxim, and I turned to the agent, a colourless, rather thin man, in whose eyes I read relief as he looked upon me. I wondered why, but I had no time to think of that, because Frith had come in and was offering me sherry, and Beatrice was talking to me again. "Well, what do you think of Manderley?" "I've scarcely seen anything of it. It's beautiful, of course." She was looking me up and down, but in a direct, straightforward fashion, not maliciously like Mrs. Danvers. Now Maxim came to my side, putting his arm through mine, giving me confidence. "You're looking better, old man," she said to him, then nodded at me. "I suppose we've got you to thank for that. He was a perfect wreck 6 months ago. Thought he was in for a breakdown. Giles, bear me out." "Well, I must say, old chap," said Giles, "you're looking a different person." "Maxim's very tanned," I said. "You should have seen him in Venice having breakfast on the balcony trying to catch the sun. He thinks it makes him better looking." Everyone laughed, and from then on conversation was easy. Lunch passed off better than I dared to hope, and afterwards Beatrice and I went out onto the terrace and walked down onto the smooth green lawns. "I think it's a pity you came back to Manderley so soon," said Beatrice. "It would have been far better to potter about in Italy for 3 or 4 months and then come back in the middle of the summer. I can't help feeling it's going to be rather a strain here for you at first." "Oh, I don't think so," I said. "I know I shall come to love Manderley." She didn't answer, and we strolled backwards and forwards on the lawns. Suddenly she said, "How do you get on with Mrs. Danvers?" I bent down and began stroking Jasper's ears. "She scares me a little. I've never seen anyone quite like her before." "I don't suppose you have," said Beatrice. "Of course she's insanely jealous. I was afraid she would be." I looked up at her. "Why? Maxim doesn't seem to be particularly fond of her." "My dear child, it's not Maxim she's thinking of." Beatrice paused, frowning a little. "She resents your being here at all, that's the trouble." "But why should she resent me?" But I thought you knew. I thought Maxim would have told you." Mrs. Danvers simply adored Rebecca. After a honeymoon of 7 weeks motoring through Italy and France, Maxim and I came to Manderley. Initially I was overwhelmed by the size of the house, and especially by the formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. It was Maxim's sister Beatrice who revealed why Mrs. Danvers seemed to resent me so much. She'd simply adored Rebecca. We stood in the drive watching the car containing Beatrice and Giles disappear. Maxim took my arm. "Thank God they've gone. Let's go for a walk." "It's going to rain," I said. I'll run upstairs for my coat." "Oh, there's heaps of raincoats in the flower room." He called out, "Robert, fetch a Mac from the flower room, will you, for Mrs. De Winter?" As Robert came running out of the hall carrying a raincoat, Jasper too came bounding out, barking hysterically at the prospect of his walk. The coat was too big, of course, but I slipped into it and we set off together to the woods, Jasper running in front. "There," said Maxim suddenly. "Take a look at that." We stood on the slope of a wooded hill, and the path wound away before us to a valley. Azaleas grew in abundance, and the air was full of their scent. "We call it the Happy Valley," he said. We came to the end of the path, and the flowers formed an archway above our heads. We bent down, passing underneath, and when I stood straight again, I saw that we were standing in a narrow cove, the shingle hard and white under our feet, and the sea was breaking on the shore beyond us. Maxim smiled down at me. "It's a shock, isn't it? No one ever expects it." As we looked around, we saw that Jasper had disappeared. We called and whistled until, in the distance, beyond the rocks to the right of the beach, I heard a short, sharp bark. "He's climbed over this way," I said. I began to scramble up the slippery rocks in the direction of the bark. "Come back," said Maxim. "The fool of a dog must look after himself. He knows his own way home." I pretended not to hear and began scrambling over the rocks towards Jasper. I came up beside a big boulder that had hidden the view, and I saw, to my surprise, that I was looking down into another cove, similar to the one I'd left. A small stone breakwater had been thrown out across the bay, forming a tiny natural harbour. The woods came right down to the tangle of seaweed marking high water, and at the fringe of the woods was a long, low building, half cottage, half boathouse. There was a man on the beach in long boots and a sou'wester, and Jasper was running round him in circles, barking. "Jasper!" I shouted. "Come here!" The dog looked up, wagging his tail, but he didn't obey me. I climbed down to the beach. When the man looked up at me, I could tell at a glance that he was somewhat retarded. "Have you got any string?" I said. "I want something to tie the dog." He shook his head. "No shells here. Been digging for shells since forenoon." He leaned forward. "I know that dog. He comes for the house. He's not yourn." "He's Mr. De Winter's dog," I said. "I want to take him back to the house." Wondering if there was any string in the boathouse, I walked towards it. The windows were boarded up, but to my surprise the door was unlocked. I expected to find the usual boat store, but the room was fully furnished. There were even books in the bookcase. For a moment I thought it must be inhabited, but as I looked around I saw no sign of recent occupation. The fabric on the sofa bed had been nibbled by mice or rats, and it was damp in the cottage. There was another door at the end of the room. In here I saw ropes and blocks, 2 or 3 sails, fenders, all the litter that goes with the use of boats. A ball of twine lay on a shelf, a rusted clasp knife beside it. I opened the knife and cut a length of twine and left the cottage. The man was watching me, Jasper at his side. I bent down and tied the string loosely round Jasper's collar. "Good afternoon," I said, and the man nodded, staring at me with his narrow eyes. "I saw ye go in yonder, but Ben won't tell." "It's all right," I said. "Mr. De Winter won't mind." "She don't go in there now," said Ben. "She gone in a sea, ain't she? She won't come back no more." "No," I said. "She'll not come back." When I got back to Maxim, he was furious. "Why do you think I didn't want to cross to the other beach? I never go near the bloody place, or that goddamned cottage. And if you had my memories, you wouldn't want to go there either." His face was white, and his eyes strained and wretched. I took hold of his hand, holding it tight. "I'm sorry, darling. Please let everything be all right." "We ought never to have come back to Manderley," he said. "Oh, God, what a fool I was to come back." He strode through the trees, and I had to run to keep pace with him, dragging poor Jasper after me on the end of his string. When we got in, Maxim went straight to the library. Frith was in the hall, and he helped me off with my mackintosh. "Your handkerchief, madam," he said, picking up something that had fallen on the floor. "Thank you," I said, putting it in my pocket. Frith took the coat to the flower room, and I walked slowly across to the library. Maxim was in his chair, Jasper at his feet, the old dog in her basket. I went and knelt down by his side and put my face close to his. "Don't be angry with me any more," I whispered. "I love you so much." He took my face in his hands and looked down at me. "Do you?" he said. "Do you?" The door opened, and I sank back on my heels as Frith came into the room followed by Robert, and the ritual of our tea began. When we were alone again, I saw that the colour had come back into Maxim's face, and he was reaching for a sandwich. I took a piece of crumpet and divided it between the 2 dogs. Then my fingers were messy with the butter, and I felt in my pocket for a handkerchief. I drew out a tiny scrap of a thing, lace-edged. It wasn't mine, and then I remembered that Frith had picked it up in the hall. I turned it over. There was a monogram in the corner, a tall, sloping R. I must have been the first person to put on that mackintosh since the handkerchief was used. She who'd worn the coat then was tall, slim, broader than me about the shoulders. I wiped my fingers with the handkerchief, and as I did so I noticed that a dull scent clung about it still. A scent I recognized. I shut my eyes, and then I knew. The vanished scent was the same as the azaleas in the Happy Valley. The weather was wet and cold for quite a week, and we didn't go down to the beach again. People from the neighbourhood started visiting to pay their respects to the new mistress of Manderley, and I began to return the visits. Returning home in the car after one such occasion, we passed Frank Crawley on the road. I tapped on the glass and told the chauffeur to stop. "I think I'll get out and walk with Mr. Crawley." Frank opened the door for me. "Been paying calls, Mrs. De Winter?" "Yes, Frank. I've been calling on the bishop's lady. She wants to know when we're going to give a fancy dress ball at Manderley. She came to the last one, she said, and enjoyed it very much. I didn't know you have fancy dress dances here, Frank." "Oh, yes. The Manderley ball was an annual affair. Everyone in the county came. A lot of people from London, too. Quite a big show." "It must have taken a lot of organisation," I said. "I suppose Rebecca did most of it." I looked straight ahead of me, but I could see his face was turned towards me, as though he wished to read my expression. "We all of us worked pretty hard," he said. "I'm afraid I shouldn't be much use if we had a dance," I said. "I'm no earthly use at organising anything." "There'd be no need for you to do anything. You'd just be yourself. Look decorative." "That's very polite of you, Frank, but I'm afraid I shouldn't be able to do that very well either." "I think you'd do it excellently," he said. Dear Frank Crawley. How tactful he was and considerate. I almost believed him. "Will you ask Maxim about the ball?" I said. "Why don't you ask him?" "No," I said. "No, I don't like to." I'd arrived at Manderley without a lady's maid, a cause of some surprise to Mrs. Danvers, who made it her task to find somebody suitable as soon as possible. Soon she'd engaged Clarice, the daughter of somebody on the estate, a nice, quiet, well-mannered girl who, thank heaven, had never been in service before and had no alarming standards. I felt at ease with her. Mrs. Danvers must have thought we'd be fit company for each other. Now that I knew the reason for Mrs. Danvers' resentment, it made things a little easier. I knew it was not just me personally she hated. She'd have felt the same towards anyone who'd taken Rebecca's place. I began to feel sorry for her. It must hurt her every time she heard me called Mrs. De Winter. Indeed, sitting in the morning room, using the internal telephone that Rebecca had used, holding the pen Rebecca had held, I couldn't help feeling like a guest in Manderley, waiting for the return of the hostess. A little china cupid stood on the desk, so when, in my clumsy fashion, I accidentally knocked him over and he broke into fragments, full of guilt I swept up the pieces into my hand. I found an envelope to put them in, and I hid the envelope in the back of one of the drawers in the desk. Foolish of me to think that the absence of the cupid would go unobserved. Mrs. Danvers noticed almost immediately, and accused Robert of removing it. I was with Maxim when Frith reported the unpleasantness below stairs. Max asked to speak to Mrs. Danvers. Before she arrived, there was nothing for it but to own up. So when Frith ushered Mrs. Danvers into the room, Maxim shrugged, half amused, half angry. "It's all a mistake, Mrs. Danvers. Apparently Mrs. De Winter broke the cupid herself and forgot to say anything." They all looked at me. It was like being a child again. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I never thought Robert would get into trouble." Mrs. Danvers looked at me with her white skull's face and her dark eyes. I felt she'd known it was me all along and had accused Robert to see if I'd had the courage to confess. Maxim had to go up to London at the end of June to some public dinner. He'd be away for 2 days, and I dreaded his going. It was as though I had a premonition of something awful about to happen. That afternoon I went for a walk with Jasper down to the beach. When I returned through Happy Valley, I was surprised to see, drawn up behind the azaleas where it couldn't be seen from the house, a long, low sports car. I didn't want to face a caller dressed as I was, and hesitated at the edge of the lawn. For no reason, I looked up at the house, and as I did so I noticed with surprise that the shutters of one of the windows in the west wing had been opened up. Somebody stood by the window. A man. And then he must have caught sight of me, because he drew back abruptly, and a figure behind him put up an arm and closed the shutters. It was Mrs. Danvers. On the day Maxim departed for London, I went for a walk with Jasper. Returning to the house, I found a sports car hidden in the grounds. Then I noticed that a shutter in the west wing was open, and a man was standing at the window. Suddenly, a figure behind him pulled the shutter closed. It was Mrs. Danvers. I strolled rather self-consciously across the lawn to the house, aware that they might be watching me still from a chink in the shutters. I remembered I'd left my knitting in the morning room before lunch, and I went along to fetch it, the faithful Jasper at my heels. The morning room opened out from the large drawing room, and I'd just picked up my knitting when I heard voices. I darted back and waited behind the door, frowning at Jasper, who stood in the doorway looking at me, his tail wagging. Then Jasper trotted out into the drawing room. I heard the man say, "Hello, you little tyke." Jasper began to bark excitedly, and then the man came into the room. He did not see me at first because I was behind the door, but Jasper made a dive at me, still barking with delight. The man wheeled round suddenly. He was a big, hefty fellow, good-looking in a rather flashy way. I could smell the whiskey on his breath. He began to smile, the sort of smile he'd give to every woman. "I hope I haven't startled you." I came out from behind the door, looking no doubt as big a fool as I felt. "Of course not. I heard voices. I didn't expect any callers this afternoon." "It's too bad of me to butt in on you like this. I hope you'll forgive me. The fact is, I just popped in to see old Danny. She's a very old friend of mine." He looked up. "How's old Max?" "He's very well, thank you," I said. "He's gone up to London." "And left the bride all alone? Isn't he afraid someone will come and carry you off?" Just then Mrs. Danvers came into the room. "Hello, Danny," he said. "All your precautions were in vain. The mistress of the house was hiding behind the door. Well, aren't you going to introduce me?" "This is Mr. Favell, madam," said Mrs. Danvers. "How do you do?" I said. He held out his hand. "I'd best be on my way. Goodbye. It's been a lot of fun meeting you. By the way, it would be very sporting of you if you didn't mention this little visit of mine to Max. He doesn't exactly approve of me. I'm not sure why, and it might get poor old Danny into trouble." "No," I said. "No, all right." As Mrs. Danvers led him away, Jasper at their heels, I wondered who he was, this man, Favell. He'd called Maxim Max. No one ever called him Max. I had seen it written only once, on the flyleaf of a book. Max, from Rebecca. I'd thought there was only one person who ever called him Max. What had Favell and Mrs. Danvers been up to? Left alone, the house was very still and quiet. I walked upstairs and turned towards the west wing. I paused by the room I thought I wanted, the one whose windows looked out upon the lawns to the sea. I turned the handle and went in. At the end of this room was another door, open. I went through and turned on the light. My first impression was shock. The room was fully furnished, as though in use. There were brushes and combs on the dressing table, scent and powder. The bed was made up. There were flowers on the dressing table. A satin dressing gown lay on a chair, and a pair of bedroom slippers beneath. For one desperate moment I thought I was seeing back into time. In a minute Rebecca would come in, sit at her dressing table, reach for her comb, run it through her hair. If she sat there, I should see her reflection in the glass, and she'd see me too, standing by the door. But nothing happened. I walked slowly into the middle of the room. No, it wasn't used. Even the flowers couldn't destroy the musty smell. Rebecca would never come back into the room again. She laid buried in the crypt of the church with all the other dead De Winters. I went to the window and swung back the shutter. Yes, I was standing at the same window where Favell and Mrs. Danvers had stood half an hour ago. I turned. Mrs. Danvers hadn't exaggerated. It was the most beautiful room in the house. Aware of a growing sense of horror, turning to despair, I walked over to the bed and traced with my fingers the monogram on the nightdress case. R. de W. The light from the shutter shone also on the golden coverlet, picking out clearly the tall, sloping R of the monogram. Then I heard a step behind me, and turning, I saw Mrs. Danvers. I shall never forget the expression on her face. Triumphant, gloating. She came nearer. "Is anything the matter, madam?" I backed away from her. "I'm all right, Mrs. Danvers. I was looking up at the windows from the lawn and I noticed one of the shutters wasn't quite closed." She went across and clamped back the shutter. Then she came back and stood beside me. "Why did you say that? I closed the shutter before I left the room. You opened it yourself, didn't you? You wanted to see the room. Why have you never asked me to show it to you before? I was ready to show it to you every day. Now you are here. Let me show you everything." She took hold of my arm and walked me towards the bed. I couldn't resist her, though the touch of her hand made me shudder. "That was her bed. I keep the golden coverlet on it always. It was her favourite. Here's her nightdress inside the case. This was the nightdress she was wearing for the last time before she died. I put it out like this, and the dressing gown and slippers, just as I put them out for her the night she never came back, the night she was drowned." She led me to the dressing table. There are her brushes, just as she used them. I used to brush her hair for her every evening. "Come on, Danny, hair drill," she'd say, and I'd stand behind her by the stool here and brush away for 20 minutes at a time. When she was first married, Mr. De Winter used to brush it for her. I've come into this room time and time again and seen him in his shirt sleeves with the 2 brushes in his hand. "Harder, Max, harder," she'd say, laughing up at him, and he'd do as she told him. She paused. "You'd like to see her clothes, wouldn't you?" She didn't wait for my answer, but led me to the dressing room and opened the wardrobes one by one. Furs in one, evening clothes in another, still redolent with her azalea scent. "These are her underclothes, in this drawer. She was wearing slacks, of course, and a shirt when she died. They were torn from her body in the water, though. There was nothing on the body when it was found all those weeks afterwards." Her fingers tightened on my arm. The rocks had battered her to bits, you know. Her beautiful face, unrecognisable. And both arms, gone. Mr. De Winter identified her. He went up to Edgecombe to do it. He went quite alone. He was very ill at the time, but no one could stop him, not even Mr. Crawley. I didn't want to hear any more. I had to get away from her, from the room. "You know now why Mr. De Winter doesn't use these rooms any more. He hasn't used them since the night she was drowned." She looked at me. "But it's not only this room. I feel her everywhere in the house. You do too, don't you?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes, When I walk along the corridor here, I fancy I hear her just behind me. That quick, light footstep. I couldn't mistake it. Do you think she can see us talking to one another now? Do you think the dead come back and watch the living? I dug my nails into my hands. Sometimes, she whispered. I wonder if she comes back here to Manderley and watches you and Mr. De Winter together. We stood staring at one another. Then she opened the door into the corridor. Robert has orders to take your tea out under the chestnut tree. She stepped aside for me to pass. I stumbled out and back into my own rooms in the east wing. I shut the door of my room and turned the key and put the key in my pocket. Then I lay down on my bed and closed my eyes. I felt deadly sick. It was one Sunday, I remember, when we had an invasion of visitors during the afternoon, that the subject of the fancy dress ball was first brought up. It was one of them, Lady Cowan, who asked if we'd be holding the annual fancy dress ball, which had been the tradition at Manderley for many years. At first I was uncertain, but the visitors pressed us, and finally I gave way and Maxim agreed to host the event. Frank Crawley, dear Frank, said he'd do all the organising with Mrs. Danvers' help. For a long time I was uncertain about my costume. "What will you wear?" I said to Maxim. "I never dress up," said Maxim. "It's the one perk allowed to the host, isn't it, Frank?" "What on earth shall I go as?" I said. "I'm not much good at dressing up. I'll have to think very carefully." In the end, surprisingly, it was Mrs. Danvers who came up with the solution. "I wonder you don't copy one of the pictures in the gallery," she said. "They'd all make good costumes, especially that one of the young lady in white, with her hat in her hand." Did she want to be friends with me at last? "Hasn't Mr. De Winter suggested a costume for you?" she said. "No," I said. "I want to surprise him and Mr. Crawley. I don't want them to know anything about it." "When you do decide," she said, "I should advise you to have your dress made in London. Voce in Bond Street is a good place, I know." "I must remember that," I said. So that's what I did. I carefully copied the dress from the portrait and sent it to London to be made up. On the night of the ball, Giles, dressed as an Arabian sheikh, and Beatrice as someone from his harem, arrived early. They stood at the foot of the stairs, chatting with Maxim and Frank, who'd turned up as a pirate. Upstairs I put on the dress, which fitted perfectly. When I put on the wig, I felt as though my own dull personality was submerged at last. I left my room and came forward to the head of the stairs. I stood there for a moment, smiling, my hat in my hand, like the girl in the picture. I waited for the clapping and laughter that would follow as I walked slowly down the stairs. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. They all stared at me like dumb things. Beatrice uttered a little cry and put her hand to her mouth. Maxim stared up at me, his face ashen white. I hesitated, one foot already on the stairs. Something was wrong. Then Maxim moved forward, his eyes never leaving my face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "What is it?" I said, terrified at his eyes. "What have I done?" "Go and change," he said. "It doesn't matter what you put on. Find an ordinary evening frock. Anything will do. Go now before anybody comes." I turned and ran through the archway. As I reached the corridors beyond, I saw that the door leading to the west wing was wide open and that someone was standing there. It was Mrs. Danvers. I shall never forget the expression on her face. Loathsome, triumphant. The face of an exulting devil. When Maxim agreed to resume Manderley's annual fancy dress ball, I had no idea what costume to wear, but I wanted to keep it a surprise. It was Mrs. Danvers who suggested that I might copy one of the portraits in the gallery. But when I appeared in the dress on the night of the ball, Maxim seemed horrified and insisted I change out of it at once. Clarice was waiting for me in my bedroom. As soon as she saw me, she burst into tears. I didn't say anything. I began tearing at the hooks of my dress. Clarice came to help me, still crying. "It's all right, Clarice," I said. "It's not your fault." "What will you wear instead, madam?" "I don't know. Clarice, would you be a dear and leave me? Don't worry, I'll manage. I want you to enjoy the party, and Clarice—" "Yes, madam." "Don't say anything about what's just happened." "Oh, no, madam." Somebody knocked on the door, and Beatrice, a rather ludicrous figure in her Eastern drapery, came in. Clarice slipped out behind her. Beatrice came across to me, holding out her arms. "Oh, you poor dear. You couldn't possibly have known. Why should you?" "Known what?" I said. "Why, the dress. The picture you copied of the girl in the gallery. It was what Rebecca wore at the last fancy dress ball at Manderley. Identical. The same dress. Oh, you stood there on the stairs, and for one ghastly moment I thought—" She didn't go on. "Oh, you poor child. How were you to know? Only it was such a shock, you see, and Maxim—" "Yes?" I said. "Oh, he thinks you did it deliberately. Oh, some foolish joke. I told him at once you couldn't have done such a thing." "I ought to have known," I said. "It's all my fault." No, it was sheer bad luck you chose that particular picture. You'll be able to explain. Now everything's going to be all right. The first lot of people were just arriving as I came upstairs. I've told Frank and Giles to make up a story about your dress not fitting." She went to my wardrobe and flung open the doors. "What can you wear instead? Here, this blue looks charming. Put this on. Nobody will mind. Quick, I'll help you." When I look back at my first party at Manderley, my first and my last, I can remember standing beside Maxim at the bottom of the stairs, can feel the stiff, set smile on my face that didn't match the misery in my eyes. The figure who stood beside me was wooden too. His face was a mask. His eyes looked through me, cold, expressionless, to some place of private pain I couldn't enter. He never spoke to me. He never touched me. We stood beside one another, the host and the hostess, putting up a miserable sham performance for the sake of all these people I didn't know and didn't want to see again. The evening dragged on, hour after hour, until finally the fireworks display on the lawn brought proceedings to an end. People flocked to say their goodbyes and to offer their congratulations on a wonderfully successful evening. Finally, I walked slowly up the stairs and went to my room. I got into bed and lay back, hoping for sleep. But my bedside clock ticked out the minutes, and I lay watching the hand move round the dial. I think I finally fell asleep a little after 7 in the morning. When I awoke, it was past 11. Maxim's bed was empty. He hadn't slept in it. The full anguish of the night before was once again upon me. I no longer made any effort to pretend. Last night had shown me that my marriage was a failure. I was too young for Maxim, too inexperienced, and more important still, I wasn't of his world. He wanted something I couldn't give him, something he'd had before. Even Mrs. Van Hopper, with her cheap views, had known that I was making a mistake. Maxim wasn't in love with me. He belonged to Rebecca. He still thought about Rebecca. She was in the house still, as Mrs. Danvers had said. She was in that room in the west wing. She was down in the stone cottage on the beach. Her footsteps sounded in the corridors. Her scent lingered on the stairs. Rebecca was still mistress of Manderley. Rebecca was still Mrs. De Winter. I could fight the living, but I couldn't fight the dead. Rebecca was too strong for me. I had a bath, dressed, and went downstairs. Robert was in the hall. "Good morning, Robert. Have you seen Mr. De Winter anywhere?"
"He went out soon after breakfast, madam. I couldn't say where."
I went out to the terrace. The day had turned misty. One of the gardeners passed me with a barrow full of litter. He looked across to where the trees loomed thin and indistinct.
"It's coming up very thick. Good thing it wasn't like this last night."
He touched his cap and went off, trundling his barrow. I went across to the edge of the woods. The white fog rolled on past me, and when I looked back at the house, its outlines were blurred. But I could see that the shutter had been pulled aside from the window of the large bedroom in the west wing, and that someone was standing there. For one moment of shock, I believed it to be Maxim. Then I saw an arm reach up, and I knew it was Mrs. Danvers. She knew the part I'd played through the long hours, standing by Maxim's side in my blue dress, and that he hadn't looked at me nor spoken to me. She knew, because she'd meant it to happen. This was her triumph, hers and Rebecca's. But she wasn't dead like Rebecca. I could speak to her. On a sudden impulse, I walked back to the house. I went up the great stairs, passed through the door to the west wing, and so along to Rebecca's room. I turned the handle and went inside. Mrs. Danvers was still standing by the window. She turned to look at me, and I saw her eyes were red and swollen with crying, even as mine were. I hadn't expected to find her so. I'd pictured her smiling as she smiled last night, cruel and evil. I hesitated, my hand still on the knob of the open door.
"I left the menu on the desk as usual," she said. "Do you want something changed?"
"Mrs. Danvers, I haven't come to talk about the menu. You know that, don't you?" She didn't answer me. "You meant this to happen, didn't you?" I said. "Are you pleased now? Are you happy?" She turned her head away and looked out of the window.
"I thought I hated you, but I don't now."
"Why should you hate me?" I asked. "What have I ever done to you?"
"You tried to take Mrs. De Winter's place."
"Many people marry twice," I said. "You talk as though my marrying Mr. De Winter was a sacrilege against the dead. Haven't we as much right to be happy as anyone else?" She turned at last to look at me.
"Mr. De Winter isn't happy. Any fool can see that. He's still in hell, and he's looked like that ever since she died."
I wasn't afraid of her any more. I went up to her. "You made me wear that dress last night. I should never have thought of it but for you. You did it because you wanted to make Mr. De Winter suffer. Hasn't he suffered enough without your playing that vile, hideous joke upon him?" Angry colour flooded her dead white face.
"What do I care for his suffering? He's never cared about mine. How do you think I've liked it, watching you sit in her place, touch the things that were hers, hear Frith and Robert and the rest of the servants talking about you as Mrs. De Winter, and all the while the real Mrs. De Winter lying dead and cold in the church crypt? If he suffers, then he deserves to suffer."
Mrs. Danvers came close to me.
"It's no use, is it? You'll never get the better of her. She's still mistress here, even if she is dead. She's the real Mrs. De Winter, not you. Well, why don't you leave Manderley to her? Why don't you go?"
I backed away from her toward the window, my old fear and horror rising in me again. She took my arm and held it like a vice.
"We none of us want you. He doesn't want you. He never did. He can't forget her. He wants to be alone in the house again, with her. It's you who ought to be dead, not Mrs. De Winter."
She pushed me towards the open window. I could see the terrace below me indistinct in the white wall of fog.
"Why don't you jump? It wouldn't hurt. It's a quick, kind way, not like drowning."
I held onto the windowsill.
"Don't be afraid," said Mrs. Danvers. "I won't push you.
You can jump of your own accord. What's the use of your staying here at Manderley? You're not happy. Mr. De Winter doesn't love you. There's not much for you to live for, is there? Why don't you jump now and have done with it? The fog came thicker than before, and the terrace was hidden from me. If I jumped, I shouldn't see the stones rise up to meet me. It would soon be over. And Maxim didn't love me. Maxim wanted to be alone again with Rebecca. Go on, whispered Mrs. Danvers. Don't be afraid. I shut my eyes. Soon, I wouldn't have to think about Rebecca any more. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by an explosion that shook the window where we stood. I opened my eyes and stared at Mrs. Danvers. The burst was followed by another, and yet a third and fourth. "What is it?" I said. "What has happened?" Mrs. Danvers relaxed her grip upon my arm. "It's the rockets. A ship must have gone ashore in the bay." And then we heard the sound of footsteps running on the terrace beneath us. It was Maxim. I couldn't see him, but I could hear his voice. He was shouting for Frith as he ran. Their figures loomed out of the mist beneath us. "She's ashore, all right," called Maxim. "I was watching her from the headland and saw her head for the reef. Tell them in the house to stand by with food and drink, and ring through to Mr. Crawley and tell him what's happened. I'm going back to the cove." I left Mrs. Danvers and went down to the beach. The fog had almost gone, and when I came to the cove, I could see the ship at once, lying about 2 miles offshore. She lay at an awkward angle, her stern tilted, and there were a number of boats already pulling round her. I saw Frank talking to one of the coastguards, and went over to them. Frank told me that Maxim had taken an injured sailor into town to a doctor. Meanwhile, divers had been sent down to see if the ship could be shifted. I stayed on the cliffs for most of the afternoon, watching the divers at work. Finally, at about 4 o'clock, I returned to the house to find Captain Searle, the harbour master of Kerrith, waiting to see either Maxim or me. "I'm sorry my husband isn't back, Captain Searle," I said. "I haven't seen him all day."
I'd heard he'd been to Kerrith, but I missed him there. The fact is, I've got some news for Mr. De Winter, and I hardly know how to break it to him."
"What sort of news, Captain Searle?" He hesitated.
"Well, we sent the diver down to inspect the ship's bottom, and while he was down there he came across the hull of a little sailing boat, lying on her side. He's a local man, of course, and he recognised the boat at once. It was the little boat belonging to the late Mrs. De Winter."
"I'm so sorry, but couldn't the boat be left there as it is? It's not doing any harm, is it?"
But that wasn't all, Mrs. De Winter. My man looked into the cabin and got the fright of his life. You see, lying there, on the cabin floor, was a body.
Maxim had said not a word to me during the fancy dress ball, and I was certain our marriage was over. The next day, Mrs. Danvers almost convinced me that my best course would be to throw myself from the window. I was saved by distress signals announcing that a ship had foundered on the reef. When later the harbour master arrived at Manderley with the shocking news that a diver had discovered Rebecca's boat, he also revealed that lying on the cabin floor was a body. I stared at the captain. But she was supposed to be sailing alone. There must have been someone with her then.
"It looks like it," said Captain Searle. "Mind you, the body's all eaten away. It's just a skeleton."
The door opened and Maxim came in.
"Captain Searle? I didn't know you were here. Is anything the matter?"
Like the coward I was, I left the room and went and sat on the terrace until I heard Captain Searle's car starting up in the drive. Then I went slowly through to the library. Maxim was standing by the window, his back turned to me. I went and stood beside him. I reached out for his hand and laid it against my cheek. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. He put his arm round me and pulled me to him. I stood with my face against his shoulder. "You've forgiven me, haven't you?" I said. "Forgiven you? What have I to forgive you for?" "Last night, you thought I did it on purpose." "Ah, that," he said. "I'd forgotten. I was angry with you, wasn't I?" He went on holding me close. "Maxim," I said, "can't we start all over again? I don't want you to love me. I won't ask impossible things. I'll be your friend and companion. I don't ever want more than that." He took my face between his hands and looked at me. "It's too late, my darling. We've lost our little chance of happiness." "No, Maxim, no." "Oh, yes," he said. "It's all over now. The thing I've always foreseen has happened. The thing I've dreamt about day after day, night after night." He sat down on the window seat, and I knelt in front of him, my hands on his shoulders. "What are you trying to tell me?" He put his hands over mine and looked into my face. "Rebecca has won." I stared at him, my hands suddenly cold beneath his. Her damned shadow has been between us all the time. I remembered her eyes as she looked at me before she died. I remembered that slow, treacherous smile. She knew this would happen even then. She knew she'd win in the end. "Maxim," I whispered, "what are you trying to tell me?" "Her boat. They found it." "Yes, I know. You're thinking about the skeleton the diver found in the cabin, aren't you?" "Yes," he said. "And that means somebody was sailing with Rebecca at the time, and you have to find out who it was. That's it, isn't it, Maxim?" "No, you don't understand. Rebecca was alone. It's Rebecca lying there on the cabin floor." "No," I said. "No." "The woman buried in the crypt. That's not Rebecca. It's the body of some unknown woman. There never was an accident. Rebecca wasn't drowned. I killed her. I shot Rebecca in the cottage in the cove. I carried her body to the cabin and took the boat out that night and sunk it. It's Rebecca's skeleton lying there on the cabin floor. Now will you look into my eyes and tell me that you love me?" I got up and put my arms around him. "It's not too late. You're not to say that. You don't understand. I love you more than anything in the world." "But how can we be together?" he said. "Now that this has happened, there is no time. We may only have a few days. They found Rebecca. They'll identify her, and then they'll remember the other one, the woman buried there in the crypt." Feeling was coming back to me little by little, as I knew it would. "Does anyone know?" I said. "Anyone at all except you and me?" He shook his head. "Frank," I said suddenly. "Are you sure Frank doesn't know?" "How could he?" said Maxim. "There was nobody there but myself." He sat down and put his hand up to his forehead. I went and knelt beside him and looked into his eyes. "I love you," I whispered. "Will you believe me now?" He kissed my face and hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "The time we've wasted, when we might have been together all these weeks. Whenever you touched me, I thought you were comparing me to Rebecca. Whenever you spoke to me, walked with me in the garden, sat down to dinner, I felt you were saying to yourself, 'This I did with Rebecca, and this, and this.'" "Oh, my God." "What is it? What's the matter?" "You think I loved Rebecca?
You think I killed her, loving her? I hated her. Our marriage was a farce. She was rotten through and through. We never had one moment of happiness together. Rebecca was incapable of love, of tenderness, of decency. I sat on the floor, clasping my knees, staring at him. Oh, she was clever, of course. No one would guess, meeting her, that she wasn't the kindest, most generous, most gifted person imaginable. When I married her, I was told I was the luckiest man in the world. She was so lovely, so accomplished, so amusing. But all the time, I had a seed of doubt at the back of my mind. There was something about her eyes. The real Rebecca took shape and form before me, stepping from her shadow world. I found her out at once, on our honeymoon. She told me about herself. Things I'll never repeat to a living soul. I knew then what I'd married. I nearly killed her then. But she made a bargain with me. "I'll run your house for you," she said. "I'll look after your precious Manderley for you, make it the most famous showplace in the country if you like, and people will visit us and envy us. What a leg pull, Max!" She knew I'd sacrifice pride, honour, personal feelings, rather than stand before our little world after a week of marriage and have them know the things about her that she told me. She knew I'd never stand in a divorce court and give her away. And so for years, everybody believed that Maxim had a perfect marriage. But all the time, Rebecca was satisfying her voracious sexual appetite in her London flat, or in the boathouse to which she began inviting her various lovers, including her cousin Jack Favell. For the sake of their agreement, Maxim let the debauchery continue. But eventually Rebecca went too far. One night Maxim went down to the cottage with a gun, believing Favell was with her, hoping to frighten him off. He found Rebecca alone. He said he'd divorce her if she didn't break off her relationship with Favell and the others. Rebecca was scornful. He'd never find the evidence to support a suit for divorce. In any case, she told him, she was pregnant with Favell's child. Everyone would, of course, assume it was Maxim's, and one day it would inherit Manderley. "She began to laugh," said Maxim. "I thought she'd never stop. 'God, how funny,' she said. 'I'll be the perfect mother, Max, like I've been the perfect wife, and no one will ever guess.' When I killed her, she was still smiling. I fired at her heart. The bullet passed right through." Maxim carried the body to her boat, locked it in the cabin and took the boat out to sea. He drove spikes into the hull and rowed back in the dinghy. Months later, a drowned female body turned up down the coast. The authorities thought it might be that of the vanished Mrs. De Winter and asked him to view it. Maxim identified the body as Rebecca's. "Even when I identified that body," he said, "I knew it was only a question of marking time. Finding you, loving you, doesn't alter things at all." Rebecca knew she'd win in the end. I saw that smile of hers when she died. "But Rebecca is dead," I said. "That's what we've got to remember. She can't speak, she can't bear witness. If they discover that skeleton is Rebecca, then you must say the other body was just a ghastly mistake. You will say that, won't you?" "Yes," he said. "They can't prove anything against you. No one knows but you and I." Suddenly the telephone began ringing in the little room behind the library. Maxim went in and shut the door. I sat waiting for him to return, and my heart, for all its anxiety and doubt, was light and free. I was no longer afraid of Rebecca. Her power had dissolved. She'd never haunt me again. When Maxim returned, it was to tell me that the local magistrate, Colonel Julian, had phoned to say that the body in the cabin was undoubtedly Rebecca's, and to ask if Maxim might have made a mistake in identifying the body the previous year. Maxim admitted that it was a possibility. Then Colonel Julian had said the only way forward
would be to admit the error and to affirm the correct identification at the inquest that would have to be held on Rebecca's body. Maxim looked at me. I can never forget what this has done to you. It's gone forever. That funny, young, lost look that I loved. It won't come back again. I killed that when I told you about Rebecca. You are so much older. He ran his fingers through my hair, and I wondered how I could be so happy when our little world was so black. It's going to be all right, said Maxim. The skeleton shows no sign of what happened. The bullet went right through her. There won't be any difficulty at the inquest. On the day of the inquest, I went into town with Maxim, but stayed in the car until I was sure he'd given his evidence. Then I slipped into the back of the court. Mr. Tabb, the boat builder from Kerrith, was giving evidence. He'd converted Rebecca's boat for her and denied stoutly that it could ever have capsized. "Well, I'm afraid that's what must have happened," said the coroner. "Excuse me, sir," said the boat builder, "but I've something else to say. After the boat was brought to the surface yesterday, Captain Searle gave me permission to go and look at her. There was nothing wrong with that boat as regards the work I did to her. Then I asked the diver, and he told me she hadn't touched the ridge at all. She was lying on sand, and there wasn't the mark of a rock on her." "Well?" said the coroner. "Well, sir, what I want to know is this. Who drove the 3 holes in her planking?" "Holes?" said the coroner. "What sort of holes?" "Done with a spike. And that's not all. The seacocks had been turned full on. With those holes, sir, and the seacocks not closed, it wouldn't take long for a small boat like her to sink. It's my opinion, sir, that that boat never capsized at all. She was deliberately scuttled." When Rebecca's boat was found on the seabed, Maxim confessed to me that he'd shot her and taken the body across to her boat before sinking it. But what I'd never expected to hear was that he hadn't loved Rebecca, that their marriage had been a sham. At the inquest, a local boat builder revealed that Rebecca's boat had undoubtedly been scuttled. Maxim was sitting next to Frank in the front of the courtroom. I looked around. Mrs. Danvers sat towards the rear, Favell beside her. Suddenly, I felt I had to get out. It was so very hot. The coroner spoke. Maxim had stood up. The heat was coming up at me from the floor, rising in slow waves. "Mr. De Winter, painful as it may be, it's my duty to ask you a very personal question. Were relations between you and the late Mrs. De Winter perfectly happy?" Black spots flickered in front of my eyes. The ground was coming up to meet me. And then Maxim's voice, clear and strong. "Will someone take my wife outside? She's going to faint." The next thing I knew, I was sitting outside the courtroom and Frank was giving me a glass of water. "Mr. De Winter has asked me to take you back to Manderley." He put his arm through mine and helped me get up. "But I'd much rather stay. I want to wait for Maxim." "Maxim may be a long time." Why did he say that? What did he mean? He took my arm and walked with me to his little Morris. And then we drove back home. When we came to the house, Frank said, "Will you be all right now? I shall go back. Maxim may want me." He got quickly back into the car and drove away. Maxim might want him. Why did he say that? I went upstairs and lay down on my bed. I put my hands over my eyes. I kept seeing that courtroom and the lined, painstaking, aggravating face of the coroner. But in the end I must have slept. A crack of thunder woke me. The clock said 5. I got up and went downstairs and sat in the library. At 5:30, Robert came into the room. "The car's just driven up, madam." "Is Mr. De Winter driving it himself?" "Yes, madam." I tried to get up, but my legs were things of straw. I stood leaning against the sofa. After a minute, Maxim came into the room. "It's all over." I waited. I couldn't speak or move towards him. "Suicide," he said, "without sufficient evidence to show the state of mind of the deceased." I sat down on the sofa. Suicide? But where was the motive? "God knows. That coroner, Horridge, peering at me, wanting to know if Rebecca had money troubles. Money troubles! I'll remember that thin, pernickety little face to my dying day." Shortly afterwards, Maxim left for the church, where Rebecca's body was being brought for burial. He'd been gone only a short while, when who should appear but Favell. He'd been drinking, but he knew what he'd come to say.
"Suicide? That doddering old fool of a coroner got the jury to say suicide. God almighty! You and I know it wasn't suicide, don't we? I'm going to see justice is done to Rebecca."
Favell was still with me when Maxim returned with Frank. Maxim instantly ordered Favell from the house, but he had a surprise up his sleeve.
"You never knew I had this note from her, did you? I kept it, because it was the last thing she ever wrote to me. I'll read it to you. I think it'll interest you."
He took a paper from his pocket. I recognized that pointed, slanting hand.
"I tried to ring you from the flat, but could get no answer. I'm going down to Mander's right away. If you get this in time, will you drive down? I'll spend the night at the cottage and leave the door open for you. I've got something to tell you. Rebecca."
He put the note back in his pocket.
"That's not the sort of note you write when you're going to commit suicide, is it? Unfortunately, I got back home that night too late to drive down. Next day, I heard Rebecca had been drowned."
Then it became clear why Favell had come. Quite brazenly, he threatened to go to the police with his note unless Maxim provided him with an annual income. Instantly, Maxim walked out to the telephone and called Colonel Julian, the magistrate. When Colonel Julian arrived, Maxim invited Favell to say what he had to. Favell got up from the sofa. I had the impression that he wasn't entirely pleased with the turn of events.
"Look here, Colonel Julian. There's no sense in beating about the bush. The reason I'm here is that I'm not satisfied with the verdict at the inquest this afternoon."
"Oh," said Colonel Julian. "Isn't that for De Winter to say?"
"I don't think it is," said Favell. "I have a right to speak not only as Rebecca's cousin, but as her prospective husband, had she lived."
"Is this true, De Winter?" Maxim shrugged. "It's the first I've heard of it." Colonel Julian looked from one to the other.
"Look here, Favell. What exactly is your trouble?"
Favell brought out Rebecca's note.
"This was written a few hours before Rebecca was supposed to have set out on that suicidal sail. I want you to read it and say whether you think a woman who wrote that note had made up her mind to kill herself."
Colonel Julian read the note and handed it back to Favell. "On the face of it, no. But I don't know what the note refers to. Perhaps you do."
"I don't. But having asked me down to tell me something important, is she going to go out on an impulse and drown herself? No, Colonel Julian. By Christ, no."
Favell turned and looked at Maxim.
"Rebecca never opened those seacocks, nor made the holes in the planking. Rebecca never committed suicide. Rebecca was murdered. And if you want to know who the murderer is, there he stands, with that goddamned superior smile on his face. There's your murderer, Mr. Maximilian de Winter."
And Favell began to laugh. The laugh of a drunkard. Forced and foolish. Thank God for Favell's laugh. Thank God for his pointing finger, his flushed face, his staring bloodshot eyes. Because Colonel Julian didn't believe him. Mr. Favell, you were present at the inquiry this afternoon. Why didn't you produce that letter in court?
Because I didn't choose to. I preferred to come and tackle De Winter personally.
Maxim came forward from the window. That's why I rang you, Colonel Julian. I asked him the same question. He said he wasn't a rich man, and that if I cared to settle an income on him for life, he'd never worry me again. Frank was here, and my wife. They both heard him. It's perfectly true, sir, said Frank. It's blackmail, pure and simple. The trouble with blackmail, said Colonel Julian, is that it isn't very pure, nor is it particularly simple. It can make a lot of unpleasantness for a great many people, even if the blackmailer finds himself in jail at the end of it. Now, we want to avoid that. Favell, you say you were Mrs. De Winter's prospective husband. Can you prove that? Ask Mrs. Danvers to come here, said Favell. We all waited. Then Mrs. Danvers entered. She stood by the door, hands folded in front of her, looking from one to the other of us. Good evening, Mrs. Danvers, said Colonel Julian. Good evening, sir. Mrs. Danvers, I want to ask you a question. Were you aware of the relationship between the late Mrs. De Winter and Mr. Favell here? They were first cousins. I wasn't referring to blood relationship, Mrs. Danvers. I mean something closer than that. I'm afraid I don't understand, sir.
Oh, come off it, Danny, said Favell. You know damn well what he's driving at. I've told Colonel Julian already. Rebecca and I had lived together off and on for years, hadn't we? She was in love with me, wasn't she?
To my surprise, Mrs. Danvers considered him for a moment without speaking, and there was something of scorn in the glance she gave him. She was not.
Listen here, you old fool,
Mrs. Danvers cut him short. She wasn't in love with you or with Mr. De Winter. She wasn't in love with anyone. She despised all men. Favell flushed angrily.
Well, didn't she come down to the cottage to meet me night after night? Didn't you wait up for her? Didn't she spend the weekends with me in London?
Well, and what if she did? She had a right to amuse herself, hadn't she? Love-making was a game with her. Only a game. She told me so. She did it because it made her laugh. She laughed at you, like she did at the rest. I've known her come back and sit upstairs in her bed and rock with laughter at the lot of you. Then Mrs. Danvers began to cry. I couldn't look at her. I had to turn away. We waited, and little by little the crying ceased. Then Colonel Julian spoke. Mrs. Danvers, can you think of any reason, however remote, why Mrs. De Winter should have taken her own life? Mrs. Danvers shook her head. Colonel Julian turned to Favell. That note. There was something she wanted to tell you. It's just possible that if we knew what that something was, we might have the answer. Let Mrs. Danvers read the note. Favell handed it over. She read it twice. Then she shook her head. It's no use. I don't know what she meant. If there was something important she had to tell Mr. Jack, she'd have told me first. Colonel Julian looked around. Does anybody know how she spent that day in London? I've got her engagement diary locked in my room, said Mrs. Danvers. If you think it would be helpful, I'll go and fetch it. When she returned, she had the diary in her hand. Here are her engagements on the date she died. She gave the book to Colonel Julian. I dug my nails in my hands. I couldn't look at Maxim. Here it is, said Colonel Julian. Hare at 12, lunch at the club, and here, Baker, 2 o'clock. Who was Baker? He looked at Maxim. Maxim shook his head. Then at Mrs. Danvers. "Baker," said Mrs. Danvers.
She knew no one called Baker. I've never heard the name before.
She turned the leaves.
There's something here, among the telephone numbers. Baker. And there's a number beside it.
Colonel Julian took the book from her.
I think our best course would be to ring this number.
"I'll do it," said Frank, and went through to the telephone room. We sat waiting. He returned with a diary and a piece of paper in his hands.
"I spoke to the night porter at an address in Bloomsbury. No one lives there. The place is used during the day as consulting rooms. But we can still get hold of him, all right. The night porter gave me his address, as apparently Dr. Baker gave up his practice and left 6 months ago."
The inquest concluded that Rebecca had committed suicide, but Jack Favell came to Manderley with a note that Rebecca had written to him on the day she died. It wasn't the note of a woman about to take her own life. Accusing Maxim of having murdered her, Favell tried to blackmail him. But Maxim called the magistrate, Colonel Julian, and with Mrs. Danvers' help, they discovered that on Rebecca's last day in town, she'd visited a Dr. Baker.
"The night porter gave me Dr. Baker's address," said Frank.
Maxim looked at me, and in his eyes I read a message of farewell. For an instant, Favell, Mrs. Danvers, Colonel Julian, Frank with a slip of paper in his hands, they were all forgotten. That moment was ours, a fraction of time suspended between 2 seconds. And then Maxim turned away and held out his hand to Frank.
"Well done. What is the address?"
Frank gave him the paper.
"Somewhere near Barnet, North London. The porter didn't have a phone number."
Colonel Julian turned to Mrs. Danvers.
"Can you throw any light on the matter now?"
Mrs. Danvers shook her head. "Mrs. De Winter never needed a doctor. She despised them.
I've never heard her speak of this Dr. Baker. I can't understand it. Why didn't she tell me? Why did she keep it from me? She told me everything."
"Perhaps she didn't want to worry you," said Colonel Julian. "No doubt she made an appointment with him and saw him, and then when she came down that night, she was going to tell you all about it."
"And the note to Mr. Jack," said Mrs. Danvers suddenly. "I have something to tell you. She was going to tell him too."
Colonel Julian turned to Maxim.
"Of course. I wouldn't mind betting £1,000 on it she was going to tell Favell the result of that interview with this Dr. Baker." "But what the hell was it all about?" said Favell. "That's what I want to know."
I dared not look at them lest I betray my knowledge, for the truth screamed in their faces. Maxim had gone to the window and was looking out into the garden. I was certain that, playing itself out again in his head, was that final horrible scene with Rebecca, when she'd flung the fact of her pregnancy in his face. If only Mrs. Danvers would take her eyes away from Maxim. Now Frank saw her staring. He glanced once more at the slip of paper on which he'd written Dr. Baker's address. Then he too looked at Maxim. I believe then that some idea of the truth came to him, for he went very white. Maxim turned towards Colonel Julian and asked,
"Should I go up to town in the morning and see this Dr. Baker?" "He's not going alone," said Favell. "I don't trust him not to make his getaway. I rather think this Dr. Baker is going to prove my case after all."
He looked around at each one of us and began to laugh. I think he too had understood at last the significance of that visit to the doctor. Colonel Julian decided that he'd travel with Maxim and me. Favell would make his own way. Meanwhile, Frank would send a telegram to Dr. Baker warning him of our visit.
"That's all arranged then," said Colonel Julian. "I'll be here at 9 sharp in the morning."
It was about tea-time when we arrived outside Dr. Baker's house in Barnet. Favell had driven behind us all the way, and we walked together to the front door. Colonel Julian rang the bell, and a very young maid opened the door and showed us into the drawing-room, not used much in the summer. Colonel Julian went and stood by the empty fireplace. Maxim and I looked out of the window. Then the door opened and a man came into the room. He was medium height, rather long in the face. His hair was sandy, turning grey. Colonel Julian came forward.
"You must think this a very unorthodox invasion, Dr. Baker, and I apologise for disturbing you like this. My name is Julian. This is Mr. De Winter, Mrs. De Winter, and Mr. Favell."
"We've driven up to see you today," said Maxim, "because we found your name and the telephone number of your old consulting rooms in my wife's diary. She seems to have kept an appointment with you at 2 o'clock on her last day in London. Could you possibly verify this for us?" Dr. Baker shook his head.
"I think you've made a mistake. I should have remembered the name De Winter. I've never attended a Mrs. De Winter in my life."
"Could she have come to see you and given a false name?" said Colonel Julian.
"Why, yes, that's possible, I suppose. If you'll excuse me a few minutes, I'll go and look up my files."
He left the room. A gold clock in a glass case ticked very fast on the mantelpiece. Dr. Baker came back carrying a large book and a file case. He took them over to the table, opened the book and began turning the pages. He'd find it, of course. It was only a question of moments now, of seconds.
"On the 12th at 2 o'clock, he said, I saw a Mrs. Danvers."
"Danny?" said Favell. "What on earth—"
Maxim cut him short. "She gave a false name, of course. Do you remember the visit, Dr. Baker?" But Dr. Baker was already searching his files. I saw his fingers delve into the pocket marked D. He found it almost at once. He glanced down rapidly at his handwriting. Then he looked across at Maxim.
"Of course, this is unprofessional, you know. But your wife's dead, and the circumstances are exceptional."
He paused. He looked at every one of us in turn.
"I remember her perfectly well. She came to me for the first time the previous week, and I took some X-rays. The second visit was to find out the result."
I waited. Why couldn't he get done with it? Why must we sit there, waiting, our eyes upon his face?
"This Mrs. Danvers, or Mrs. De Winter, rather, wasn't the type to accept a lie. So I told her plainly what she herself had suspected. She stood it very well. Then she paid my fee and went out. I never saw her again."
He closed the book.
"The pain was slight as yet, but the growth was deep-rooted. In 3 or 4 months' time she'd have been under morphia. An operation would have been no earthly use at all. I told her that. You wanted to know if I could suggest any reason why your wife should have taken her life, Mr. De Winter? Well, the truth is, she was dying. She had only a few months left."
No one said a word. The little clock ticked on the mantelpiece. Then everyone was standing up. I got up from my chair too. I shook hands with Dr. Baker. We came out and went towards the cars. No one said anything for a few minutes. Favell looked grey, rather shaken.
"I never had the remotest idea," he said. "She kept it a secret from everyone. Even Danny. What a goddamned appalling thing, eh? Cancer. Oh, my God."
Maxim held open the car doors. I sat in the front. Before Colonel Julian climbed in, he turned to Favell, who was leaning against his own car. "As I shan't be seeing you again, I may as well warn you that, as a magistrate, I have certain powers that will prove effective if you ever turn up in Kerrith. Blackmail isn't much of a profession, Mr. Favell, and we know how to deal with it in our part of the world." An old, unpleasant smile was forming on Favell's lips.
"What a stroke of luck for you, Max. You think you've won, don't you? I can still get you, though."
As we turned the corner, I looked back and saw him standing there watching us, and he waved his hand, and he was laughing. Colonel Julian had a sister in St. John's Wood and had arranged to stay the night with her. Once we dropped him off, Maxim suggested that we eat before driving back to Manderley. He stopped in a narrow street in Soho, opposite one of those numerous little restaurants. We went to a table right in the corner. Sometime during our meal, Maxim said, "I believed that Rebecca lied to me on purpose. The last supreme bluff. She wanted me to kill her. She foresaw the whole thing. That's why she stood there laughing when she died." We'd only just finished eating when Maxim said suddenly, "I have this feeling we must get back tonight. It's 7:45. If we start now, we ought to be there by 2:30. "Oh, you'll be so terribly tired," I said. He shook his head. "No, I'll be all right. I want to get home. Something's wrong. I know it is. I want to get home." The traffic was light and we made good progress. After a while I must have dozed, for I saw the staircase at Manderley and Mrs. Danvers standing at the top in her black dress. Then I was writing in the morning room, sending out invitations. But when I looked down to see what I'd written, it wasn't my small square handwriting at all. It was long and slanting, with curious pointed strokes. I got up and went to the looking-glass. A face stared back at me that wasn't my own. The face in the glass stared back at me and laughed. I sat up and pushed my hair away from my face. "You've been sleeping," said Maxim. "It's 2:15. We'll be back by 3. The hills rose in front of us and dipped and rose again. The stars had gone. "What time is it?" I asked. 2:20. "That's funny," I said. "It almost looks as though dawn's breaking over there beyond the hills. It can't be, though. It's too early." "It's the wrong direction," he said. "You're looking west." "I know," I said. "It's funny, isn't it?" He didn't answer, and I went on watching the sky. It seemed to get lighter even as I stared, like the first red streak of sunrise. Little by little, it spread across the sky. "It's in winter you see the northern lights, isn't it?" I said. "Not in summer." "That's not the northern lights," he said. "That's Manderley." I glanced at him and saw his face. I saw his eyes. "Maxim," I said, "what is it?" He drove faster, much faster. We topped the hill before us and the road to Manderley lay ahead. There was no moon. The sky above our heads was inky black, but the sky on the horizon wasn't dark at all. It was shot with crimson, like a splash of blood. And the ashes blew towards us with a salt wind from the sea.
Rebecca was written by Daphne Du Maurier and read by Alex Kingston. It was abridged by Neville Teller and was originally broadcast on BBC Radio 2. It was produced by Neil Gardner for Ladbroke Productions.